What happens if I touch you? Asked the lowly cowboy. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started with today's story. There was a lowly cowboy named Samuel who lived in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the American West. He was a man who worked with his hands, a cattle rancher struggling to make ends meet. He wasn't wealthy or powerful, and he wasn't known for being a man of many words. His life was simple: wake up early, work the land, and survive the grueling days under the scorching sun. But despite the harshness of his life, Samuel held a heart full of kindness and a deep sense of honor. His ranch was small, just enough to get by, and the land he worked was dry and cracked. There were no neighbors for miles, and his only company was the cattle and the occasional traveler passing through. One day, while tending to his chores, Samuel saw a figure on the horizon. At first, he thought it was a mirage, the heat playing tricks on his eyes. But as the figure drew closer, he realized it was a woman. She was on horseback, her posture confident, but her eyes held a sense of sadness and exhaustion. The woman's name was Mariana, and she was a Native American from the neighboring tribe. She had been traveling for days, seeking refuge from the violent tensions that were rising between her people and the settlers. She had heard of Samuel's land, known to be a safe haven for those who needed it, and so she sought him out. When she arrived at his ranch, her horse was weary, and she was exhausted from the long journey. She dismounted slowly, her eyes meeting Samuel's, a mixture of hope and hesitation in them. Samuel, unsure of how to respond, walked towards her. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Mariana hesitated, looking around at the barren land. "I need water and I need a place to rest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel nodded, offering her a hand to help her to the small cabin nearby. As he led her inside, he couldn't help but notice how different she was from the other women he had met in his life. Her presence was commanding, yet there was a softness in her eyes that told a different story, a story of survival, of pain, and of strength. As they sat in the cabin, Samuel fetched some water and handed it to her. She drank it slowly, savoring the coolness. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. Samuel nodded, feeling a strange pull in his chest. "It's nothing," he replied. But deep inside, something was stirring. Over the next few days, Mariana stayed with Samuel. She helped him with the ranch work, though her skills were more attuned to the ways of her people. She spoke of her tribe's struggles, of the wars, and of the land that was slowly being taken from them. Samuel listened, his heart heavy with the stories she shared. He knew the conflicts were beyond his control, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to do something more. Late one evening, as the sun began to set, Samuel and Mariana found themselves standing side by side outside the cabin. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, the air warm with the remnants of the day. Without thinking, Samuel reached out and gently touched Mariana's arm. It was a simple gesture, a touch that spoke of comfort, of reassurance. He looked at her, his heart racing. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and something else, something deeper. "What happens if I touch you?" he asked, his voice low, unsure of the answer. Mariana's breath caught in her throat. She had never been touched by a man like this before, with such tenderness, such respect. Her mind raced, but her heart knew the answer. "What happens," she began, her voice soft, "is something that neither of us can control." As Samuel and Mariana stood under the fading light of the day, the air between them thickened with unspoken words. The warmth of the sun had begun to wane, and with it, the silence between them became palpable. Samuel withdrew his hand slowly from Mariana's arm, the touch lingering in his mind. The moment felt like it hung in the air, suspended in time. He had touched her without thinking, but now the consequences of that touch seemed to stir something deep within him. Mariana looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps understanding, perhaps something more. She opened her mouth, her lips slightly trembling, but no words came out immediately. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "What happens happens because we're both caught between worlds, Samuel." Her words were quiet, but they seemed to echo in the space between them. Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. He had known she was different, strong, proud, and yet, when she spoke, there was a vulnerability in her tone that he had not expected. He nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but sensing that there was more to her words than just their surface meaning. The night was closing in, and as the moon began to rise, Samuel and Mariana found themselves sitting on the porch of the cabin, the cool evening air brushing their faces. The flickering light from the campfire cast long shadows on the ground, and the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees seemed to soften the heavy silence. Mariana spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I never asked for this life, Samuel. I never wanted to run, to fight, to survive. I wanted peace. I wanted a home." Her words were heavy with emotion, and Samuel could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he replied quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire. "To have nothing but the land and the struggle to hold on to it." Mariana turned to him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You don't understand, Samuel. It's not just the land. It's my people, my way of life. It's being told every day that you don't belong." Samuel felt a pang of guilt rise in his chest. He had always thought of himself as an outsider, someone who was never fully accepted by society because of his poverty and his humble origins. But hearing Mariana speak made him realize that his struggles, though real, were nothing compared to the constant battle she faced. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I can't imagine what you've gone through." Mariana shook her head, her long dark hair catching the light from the fire. "No one can. And that's the problem." The conversation shifted then, as the fire flickered and crackled between them. They spoke about their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. As the night wore on, they both began to feel a sense of connection, a bond that had formed between them in the most unexpected of ways. As the days passed, Samuel and Mariana's relationship grew deeper. Samuel found himself helping her with more than just the ranch work. He began to understand her, to see beyond the fierce exterior and recognize the pain she carried with her every day. And Mariana, for the first time in years, felt a sense of trust that she had not known since she was a child. They laughed together, shared stories, and in the quiet moments, their bond grew stronger. But Samuel could feel the weight of the world bearing down on them. He knew that the peace they had found would not last forever. The tension between the settlers and the native tribes was growing, and soon, the world outside would force them to confront the harsh realities of their situation. One evening, as they sat together, the distant sound of horses' hooves echoed through the night. Mariana stiffened, her body tensing instinctively. Samuel felt his own pulse quicken, and he rose to his feet. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Mariana's eyes met his, a look of fear in them that Samuel had never seen before. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the approaching riders. Samuel grabbed his rifle, his heart racing. He knew that whatever was coming, it was something neither of them could avoid. The question was not whether they would face it, but how they would face it together. As the sound of hooves grew louder, Mariana's body tensed even more. She had heard the rhythm of these riders before, methodical, unhurried, but carrying a sense of purpose that sent a chill through her. Samuel looked at her, his expression hardening, his grip on the rifle tightening. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They were on the brink of something much larger, something neither of them could escape. "Who is it?" Samuel asked, his voice low and steady. Mariana's eyes flicked to the horizon, where the shadowy figures were beginning to take shape in the moonlight. "It's the settlers," she said, her voice strained. "They found us." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He had heard rumors of the tensions rising between the settlers and the native tribes, but he had never imagined they would come to his doorstep. He had always thought his small, isolated ranch was far enough from the conflict, but now, it seemed there was no escaping it. The sound of the approaching riders grew louder, and Mariana's eyes filled with fear. Samuel stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stay inside," he said firmly, his voice brokering no argument. He didn't wait for her response, but turned toward the door. He couldn't let them take her. He couldn't let them harm anyone else. As he stepped outside, The cool night air hit him, and the sight of the riders grew clearer. They were dressed in the unmistakable attire of settlers, their horses moving with the precision of men who had done this before. The lead rider, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, dismounted with a fluid grace. His eyes scanned the area before locking onto Samuel. "You there?" the man called, his voice rough and commanding. "We've come for her." Samuel's heart tightened at the words. "She's under my protection," he replied, standing his ground, the rifle held firmly in his hands. "I won't let you take her." The leader of the group smirked, a cruel, knowing expression crossing his face. "You think you can stop us, cowboy? This land doesn't belong to you or anyone like her." Samuel's jaw clenched. He had heard enough. The settlers had no respect for the land, no respect for life. They only took, never gave. He took a step forward, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. The silence between them was broken only by the soft rustle of the wind. "You're making a mistake," Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't let you harm her. Not while I'm here." The leader's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glint in his eyes. He signaled to the men behind him. "Then you'll regret it," he spat, his voice sharp as a whip. Before Samuel could react, the sound of hooves thundered behind him. Mariana had stepped out of the cabin, her eyes burning with determination. She had seen enough. She knew the settlers wouldn't stop. She knew that this was not just about her, but about everything she had fought for, her people, her land, her way of life. "Samuel, stop," she called, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. "This isn't your fight." Samuel turned to look at her, his heart sinking at the pain in her eyes. "It's always been my fight," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet resolve. He looked back at the leader of the settlers. "I won't let you hurt her. You'll have to go through me first." The leader's eyes narrowed, and he reached for the revolver at his hip. "So be it," he said coldly. The tension between the two men was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. But just as the leader drew his weapon, something shifted. Mariana stepped forward, her presence commanding. She raised her hand, not in threat, but in a gesture of peace. "Enough," she said firmly. "There is no need for bloodshed." The leader paused, his hand still hovering near his weapon, but he didn't draw it. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand and looked at Mariana, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You would stop this?" he asked, his voice filled with disdain. "You would let a man like him stand between us?" Mariana's gaze never wavered. "Yes," she said simply. "I would." She turned to Samuel, her eyes softening for the first time. "This fight is not yours to fight. It is mine. Let me handle it." Samuel stood there, torn. He had always been a protector, a man who fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But as he looked at Mariana, he saw something in her eyes, a strength, a resolve, a fire that mirrored his own. He knew she was right. This was her fight. He nodded slowly, stepping back. "Then we fight together," he said quietly, his voice filled with trust. As the night stretched on, the settlers slowly retreated, their eyes never leaving Samuel and Mariana. The battle was not over, but for now, they had won a small victory. And as the stars began to fill the sky above them, Samuel and Mariana stood, side by side, knowing that this was only the beginning of the fight that would define them both. As the days passed after the tense encounter with the settlers, the landscape around Samuel's ranch began to feel more and more like a battleground. The wind carried with it the whispers of conflict, and Samuel knew that this small skirmish was only the beginning. Mariana had insisted on staying, despite the danger. She was determined to face the growing tension head-on, and Samuel could see that her resolve was unshakable. But the more he watched her, the more he realized how much this had become her fight, not just for survival, but for her people's future. It was something he could never truly understand, but something he could respect. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Samuel and Mariana sat together, their eyes scanning the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the faint sound of distant hooves. Samuel's hand rested on the rifle next to him, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. He knew the settlers wouldn't give up easily. They had a history of taking what they wanted, and they weren't likely to stop now. Mariana turned to him, her expression serious. "They won't stop, Samuel. They think they can just take whatever they want." Samuel nodded. "I know. But we can't just keep hiding. It's not the way of the land. Mariana's gaze softened as she looked at him. You've been hiding for too long, Samuel. It's time to fight, to stand up for what's ours. It's not just your ranch or my people's land. It's everything we've worked for. Samuel met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew she was right. He had spent his life trying to stay out of the conflict, hoping that he could simply live quietly on his land. But the world was changing, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The settlers had already taken so much, and if they weren't stopped, there would be nothing left for anyone. As the days went by, the tension between the settlers and the native tribes grew. Small clashes turned into full-blown skirmishes. Word spread that the settlers were organizing, gathering in larger groups to push further into native territories. It wasn't long before Samuel and Mariana found themselves at the center of it all. One evening, a small group of riders approached the ranch. Mariana's eyes narrowed as she recognized them, settlers from a nearby town. They had come for supplies, but Samuel knew better. They weren't just looking for food or water, they were looking for a reason to start a fight. As the riders dismounted, one of them stepped forward, a tall man with a weathered face and a rough demeanor. He looked Samuel over, then glanced at Mariana. We've come for what's ours, the man said, his voice low and gruff. Your ranch is sitting on land that belongs to us. We're not here for your cattle, but we'll take whatever we want if you don't cooperate. Samuel stood tall, his chest swelling with defiance. This land is mine, he said, his voice steady, and no one is taking it from me. The man scoffed, his eyes hardening. You think you can stop us? You and your little Apache girl can't stop the inevitable. Mariana stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with an edge of steel. We will not let you take what's ours, she said, her words carrying the weight of generations of resistance. The settlers exchanged glances, and for a moment, there was a tense silence. The wind howled across the plain, the only sound the distant cry of a bird. The tall settler looked at his men, and without warning, he pulled a revolver from his holster and pointed it at Samuel. Move aside, cowboy, he said coldly. We don't want trouble, but we'll take what we need. Mariana didn't flinch. Instead, she stood her ground, her eyes locked on the settlers, her hand resting on the hilt of a knife hidden beneath her cloak. Samuel could feel the heat of the moment rising. He knew that any wrong move could lead to violence, but he wasn't about to let them take his land, his home, or Mariana. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The man's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could pull it, a loud shout broke through the silence. A group of riders, native warriors, came galloping over the ridge. They were led by an elder, his face marked with the signs of battle and experience. The settlers froze, their eyes wide with shock. The elder raised his hand, signaling the riders to halt. This land is not yours, the elder said, his voice powerful and commanding. You will leave now, or you will face the consequences. The settlers looked at each other, fear creeping into their expressions. For a moment, it seemed like they might fight back, but the presence of the native warriors, their faces painted for battle, made them think twice. The tall settler gritted his teeth, lowering his revolver, but not without a final glare at Samuel and Mariana. This isn't over, he muttered. We'll be back. With that, the settlers turned and mounted their horses, retreating into the distance. The elder looked at Samuel and Mariana, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. You fought well, he said, his voice softening. But this battle is far from over. Samuel nodded, his heart still racing. He knew the elder was right. This was only the beginning. The settlers would return, and when they did, he and Mariana would have to be ready. But for now, they had won a small victory, and it was a victory they would hold on to, even as the storm clouds of war continued to gather on the horizon. The victory over the settlers had been a brief reprieve, but Samuel and Mariana both knew it was only temporary. The land around them had become a battleground, and the settlers were not the only threat they faced. The native tribes, though fiercely protective of their territories, were in constant conflict with the encroaching settlers, and now the stage was set for a much larger struggle. As the days passed, tension seemed to hang in the air like a storm ready to break. The winds that once carried the promise of peace now seemed to carry only whispers of war. Samuel had never been one for politics, but he could no longer ignore the reality of the world around him. Mariana's presence in his life had brought a clarity he had never known. The love that had slowly blossomed between them now seemed both a beacon of hope and a symbol of everything they stood to lose. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the flat plains, Samuel sat outside the cabin, watching the sky slowly brighten with hues of pink and orange. The air was crisp, and the smell of the earth beneath him was familiar, comforting. But as he watched the horizon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The riders would return, and this time, they wouldn't be alone. Mariana came to sit beside him, her gaze following his. She had seen the same things he had, heard the same rumors. The settlers were gathering, preparing to take the land by force. The native tribes were readying their defenses, but the numbers were uneven. "It's getting worse," Samuel said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. Mariana nodded, her expression hardening. "We've been here before. But this time, we stand together." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his skin. "We will protect what's ours, Samuel. No matter the cost." Samuel squeezed her hand, feeling the strength in her words, even as a part of him trembled at the thought of the coming battle. They had survived so much already, but the stakes were higher now. This was no longer just about their ranch. It was about survival itself. As the days passed, the atmosphere around them grew heavier. Samuel spent long hours reinforcing the defenses around the ranch, while Mariana worked tirelessly to prepare for the worst. Word had come that a group of settlers, larger and better armed, were heading their way. The tribe leaders had met and decided that they would make a stand, but even with their warriors, they were vastly outnumbered. Samuel knew that this battle would not be won with just courage and determination. The settlers were well equipped, and their numbers were overwhelming. They had no choice but to fight with everything they had. No retreat, no surrender. One night, as the moon hung high in the sky, the sound of approaching horses broke the silence. Samuel's heart skipped a beat, and Mariana's eyes flashed with the familiar fire he had come to admire. "They're here," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Samuel stood up, grabbing his rifle and heading for the edge of the ranch. The warriors had gathered, and the time for words was over. The night was alive with the sound of hooves as the settlers' horses drew closer. Samuel's mind raced, but he remained calm, his heart steady. This was the moment he had feared, the moment when everything they had fought for would be put to the test. The settlers appeared, a large group, their faces hard and determined. The leader, the same man who had threatened them before, rode at the front, his eyes filled with hatred. "This is your last chance," he called out, his voice carrying across the land. "Leave now, or we'll take what's ours by force." Mariana stepped forward, her eyes locked on the leader. "You have no right to this land," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This land is ours, and we will fight for it." The leader sneered, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "Then fight we shall," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. The battle that followed was fierce and relentless. The native warriors fought with the power of generations behind them, while Samuel and Mariana fought side by side, their bond growing stronger with each passing moment. The settlers were driven back, but not without a price. The battle was long, and the night was filled with the sounds of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. As dawn finally broke, the settlers retreated, their numbers diminished, their resolve shattered. But the victory was bittersweet. Samuel and Mariana stood together, bloodied but alive, their hands clasped tightly as they surveyed the battlefield. The land they had fought for was still theirs, but the cost had been high. They knew that the war was far from over. The settlers would return, and when they did, Samuel and Mariana would be ready. But for now, they had won. And in that victory, there was hope. Hope that together, they could face whatever came next. The days following the battle were filled with both relief and uncertainty. Samuel and Mariana had successfully repelled the settlers, but the scars of war were visible everywhere. The land that had been the battleground now seemed to hold the echoes of the conflict in every corner. Samuel worked tirelessly to rebuild the defenses, reinforcing every weak spot, every vulnerable section of the ranch. The war was far from over, and they both knew it. As he worked, Samuel couldn't help but think about the price they had paid. The settlers would return, and the next battle would likely be even harder. Yet, in the midst of it all, there was Mariana. Her strength, her unwavering resolve, had become the anchor that kept him steady. It wasn't just her courage in battle that moved him. It was the way she had fought for her people, for their way of life, despite the odds stacked against them. It was in the quiet moments, too, the way she held his hand when the night seemed darkest, the way her presence alone made the world feel a little less heavy. They had formed a bond through shared struggle, through shared losses, and it was this bond that gave them both the strength to face what lay ahead. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Samuel and Mariana sat together on the porch of the cabin. The air was cool, the gentle rustling of the trees the only sound breaking the silence. They didn't speak for a long while, both lost in their thoughts, but the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space they shared, a space where no words were necessary. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "This is your fight, not just mine. But I'm with you all the way." Mariana turned to him, her eyes softening. She reached out, her hand gently brushing his cheek. "It's our fight now, Samuel," she said. "We're in this together, no matter what happens." Samuel nodded, his chest tight with emotion. The weight of their situation hadn't lessened, but the certainty in Mariana's voice gave him a sense of peace. They were together, and that was more than he had ever expected in this lifetime. As the days turned into weeks, the threat of the settlers never truly dissipated. Rumors swirled that more of them were coming, their numbers swelling as they gathered under a common cause. They weren't just after land anymore. They were after everything. The native tribes had been pushed to the brink, and now, it seemed, the settlers were determined to finish what they had started. Samuel could feel the tension growing. Every day, the pressure mounted. The air crackled with the unspoken knowledge that another fight was inevitable. But Samuel and Mariana stood resolute. One afternoon, as Samuel finished repairing the last of the fences, a rider appeared on the horizon. At first, Samuel thought it was one of the settlers, but as the rider grew closer, he saw the familiar shape of an Apache warrior. It was Mariana, the tribal leader who had helped them in the earlier skirmish. She approached, her face stern but with a hint of respect in her eyes. "The settlers are gathering again," Mariana said, her voice grave. "They're coming in full force this time. They'll be here in a matter of days." Samuel felt a knot form in his stomach. "What do we do?" he asked. Mariana's eyes narrowed. "We fight," she said simply. "We fight to protect what is ours." Mariana stood beside Samuel, her hand on his arm. "We'll fight with you," she said. "We won't back down." Mariana nodded, the faintest hint of a smile appearing on her lips. "Together, we stand a chance." And so, the preparations began. Samuel and Mariana joined the warriors, training day and night. The land they had fought for was now their battleground, and every day, the settlers' presence loomed larger. The tension in the air was palpable as they gathered for the final stand. As the day of reckoning approached, Samuel and Mariana stood together once more, their hands tightly clasped. They knew that the coming battle would be their hardest yet, but they were ready. This was their land. This was their fight, and they would face it together, no matter the cost. The morning of the battle arrived, the sun rising slowly over the horizon. Samuel stood at the front of the line, his rifle in hand, his heart steady. Mariana stood beside him, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the distant rumble of approaching riders. Samuel looked over at Mariana, his heart swelling with pride. "We've got this," he said quietly. Mariana gave him a small smile, her eyes bright with a fire that only she could possess. "Together, we'll win," she said, her voice filled with certainty. As the settlers' riders appeared on the horizon, Samuel felt his pulse quicken. The moment had come, and though the fight would be fierce, the one thing that kept him going was knowing that, no matter what, they would face it side by side. The day of the final battle arrived like the inevitable crash of thunder before a storm. Samuel stood at the front of the line, his rifle steady in his hands, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the land. The air was dry and thick with dust, and Samuel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The settlers were coming, their figures already visible in the distance, their horses kicking up clouds of dirt as they approached. He glanced over at Mariana, standing beside him. Her face was resolute, her eyes filled with the same fire that had burned in her ever since their first encounter. She was ready. They both were. The warriors behind them were silent, their faces hardened by years of struggle. They had fought for this land, for their families, for their people, and now they would fight again. The land they stood on was sacred, and they would defend it with everything they had. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation, and Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of hooves grew louder. The settlers were almost upon them. As they drew nearer, Samuel's thoughts flashed back to everything that had led them to this moment. The quiet life he had once known seemed so distant now, a life that had been irrevocably altered the day he met Mariana. Since then, he had come to understand that some things were worth fighting for, things that went beyond survival. He was fighting for a future, for a chance at peace, and for the woman standing beside him. The settlers' leader, the same man who had threatened them before, rode at the front of the group. His eyes locked onto Samuel's, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. "This ends today," the leader called out, his voice filled with hatred and determination. "You can either leave now, or you can stay and die with your land." Samuel stood tall, his eyes never leaving the man's. "This land belongs to us," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "We will not leave." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Then you'll regret it." With that, the settlers charged. The warriors moved in sync with the precision of a well-trained force. The clash of swords and the thunder of gunshots filled the air as both sides collided in a storm of violence. Samuel fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose, his rifle kicking in his hands as he fired shot after shot. He could hear the war cries of the native warriors around him, the sounds of battle echoing across the plains. Mariana fought beside him, her movements swift and calculated. She had always been strong, but today, she was something more. She was a force of nature, an embodiment of everything her people had endured. Samuel could see the fire in her eyes as she took down one settler after another, her knife flashing in the sunlight. The battle raged on, and Samuel could feel the weight of each moment pressing down on him. He had fought for survival before, but this was different. This was a fight for the future, for the people he loved, and for the land that was theirs by right. The settlers pushed forward, but the native warriors held their ground. Samuel could see the leader of the settlers in the distance, still charging toward him, his revolver drawn. With every step, Samuel's resolve grew stronger. He had to face the leader, to end this once and for all. With a deep breath, Samuel sprinted toward him, his rifle in hand. The leader saw him coming and spurred his horse forward, meeting Samuel in the center of the battlefield. The two men locked eyes, their faces filled with the fury of men who had been shaped by violence. "You should have stayed out of this, cowboy," the leader spat, his voice thick with contempt. "You can't win this." Samuel's heart pounded, but his voice was calm. "I've already won," he said, his eyes never leaving the leader's. With a sudden movement, he raised his rifle, firing a single shot that struck the leader in the chest. The man fell from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The battlefield fell silent for a moment, the sounds of the fight fading away. The settlers, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. But the native warriors didn't stop. They pressed forward, pushing the settlers back, reclaiming their land with each passing minute. As the battle drew to a close, Samuel stood over the fallen leader, his heart still racing from the adrenaline. The land was theirs, but the cost had been high. He turned to see Mariana standing behind him, her face covered in dirt and blood, but her eyes bright with triumph. She walked toward him, her steps steady, her strength undeniable. Samuel reached out and took her hand, the bond between them stronger than ever. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice filled with awe. Mariana nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did," she said. "But the fight isn't over." "Not yet." Samuel looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. And they would face it together, side by side, just as they always had. The days following the battle were marked by silence and reflection. Samuel and Mariana, though victorious, knew that peace was not a guarantee. The settlers had been pushed back, But the promise of retaliation still hung in the air, like a storm cloud waiting to break. The land they had fought so fiercely to protect now seemed more fragile than ever, and as the sun set on the horizon, Samuel couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could hold on. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about their way of life, their future, and the strength of the bond they had forged in the heat of battle. The following morning, after a restless night's sleep, Samuel found himself standing at the edge of the land, looking out over the valley. The ranch was still there, still standing, but the world around it felt different. The wind carried the scent of change, and Samuel knew that it was only a matter of time before things shifted again. Mariana joined him, her presence a quiet comfort. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice steady, but with a trace of worry. Samuel didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question settle in his chest. He had hoped that the settlers would reconsider, that they would turn away and leave them to their lives. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. "They'll come," he said finally, his voice low. "But we'll be ready." Mariana nodded, her hand slipping into his. "We have to be. For everyone." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a shared sense of purpose that had only grown stronger over the course of their struggles. The settlers' defeat had not marked the end of the conflict. It had only made it more personal. The land was no longer just land. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had risked. That night, as the stars filled the sky above them, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the rhythm. The settlers were coming, just as he had feared. But this time, there was something different. This time, they weren't alone. The sound of more riders followed, and soon, the silhouettes of dozens of men appeared on the horizon. It was a small army, and Samuel knew that the battle ahead would be their hardest yet. He quickly gathered the warriors, his voice steady as he gave orders. There was no time to waste. The settlers had come with reinforcements, but so had the native tribes. Together, they would face the enemy one last time. As the riders drew closer, the tension was palpable. The air was thick with the scent of impending violence, and Samuel's pulse quickened in his chest. He looked to Mariana, who stood beside him, her face set with determination. "Are you ready?" he asked her, his voice barely above a whisper. Mariana met his gaze, her eyes fierce and unwavering. "I was born ready," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. The battle that followed was brutal and unrelenting. The sound of gunfire and the clash of swords filled the air as the settlers and the native warriors collided in a storm of violence. Samuel fought with everything he had, his rifle steady in his hands, his movements swift and calculated. Beside him, Mariana moved like a force of nature, her knife flashing in the sunlight as she took down one settler after another. The settlers, despite their reinforcements, were no match for the fury of the native warriors. The battle raged for hours, but eventually, the settlers began to retreat. They had underestimated the resolve of the people they sought to destroy. The warriors pushed forward, and the settlers, with their backs to the land they sought to claim, were forced to turn and flee. As the dust began to settle, Samuel stood, breathing heavily, his heart racing from the fight. He looked around at the battlefield, his gaze meeting Mariana's. Their eyes locked for a moment, a silent understanding passing between them. The war was not over, but the victory they had just won was theirs. It was a hard-earned victory, one that had come with a heavy price. But it was a victory all the same. The settlers had been sent packing, and for the first time in a long while, Samuel allowed himself to hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of red and gold, Samuel and Mariana stood side by side. They had fought together, and they had won together. But there was still much to be done. The land was theirs for now, but the fight for their future was far from over. They were ready for whatever came next, and as long as they had each other, they knew they could face it all. As the dust settled and the last of the settlers retreated into the distance, the land lay still, a brief calm after the storm of battle. Samuel and Mariana stood together, their bodies weary but their spirits unbroken. The warriors of the native tribes gathered around them, their faces painted with the remnants of war, their expressions a mix of triumph and solemnity. The fight had been brutal, but they had held their ground. The land, for now, was theirs. The victory felt bittersweet. Samuel could still hear the echoes of gunfire, the cries of battle, and the pounding of hooves in his ears. The cost of this victory had been high. Many lives had been lost, and the scars of war were now etched into the land and in the hearts of those who fought. But as Samuel looked at Mariana, standing beside him, he knew that their fight had meant something. They had fought not just for land, but for a future. Their future, the future of their people, and the future of the land that had sustained them for generations. Mariana reached out and took his hand, her touch warm against the coldness of the world around them. "We did it," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Samuel nodded, his heart heavy. "We did," he agreed. "But at what cost?" Mariana looked out over the battlefield, her gaze distant. "Every victory comes with a price," she said quietly. "But it's a price we were willing to pay." Samuel squeezed her hand, his mind racing with the weight of her words. They had won today, but the road ahead was uncertain. The settlers would not stop. They would return, stronger, with more resources. The battle for the land would continue. But for now, they had a moment of peace. A moment to breathe, to reflect, and to heal. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field, Samuel turned to face the warriors who had fought by his side. "This victory belongs to all of us," he said, his voice carrying across the silence. "But the war is far from over. We will continue to fight, not just for this land, but for our people, for our future." The warriors nodded, their eyes filled with the same resolve that Samuel had seen in Mariana's eyes from the very beginning. The fight was not over, but they had proven that they were stronger than their enemies. They had proven that they would not back down. "What comes next?" Samuel asked, his voice softer now. Mariana's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight were fading and the first stars of the evening began to appear. "What comes next is uncertain," she said, her voice steady. "But as long as we stand together, we will face it. No matter what." Samuel smiled, the weight of the world feeling a little lighter with her words. Together, they had faced the impossible. Together, they would continue to fight. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. As the night fell, Samuel and Mariana stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly. The land stretched out before them, vast and open, a reminder of both the challenges they had faced and the ones still to come. But no matter what the future held, they would face it with the strength they had forged in the fires of battle, with the love that had grown between them, and with the unshakable belief that together they could overcome anything. In this gripping tale of survival, bravery, and love, Samuel and Mariana faced the harsh realities of life in the Wild West. As they fight to protect their land and their way of life, they find themselves entangled in a struggle that goes beyond mere survival. This story is a powerful addition to the world of Western stories, showcasing the fierce determination of those who fought for their future. Through battles, bloodshed, and moments of quiet reflection, Samuel and Mariana navigate a turbulent world that tests their strength and their bond. As the settlers continue to push forward, the stakes become higher, and the choices they make will determine not only their fate but the future of the land they call home. With every twist and turn, this story captures the essence of Western stories, where honor, love, and courage are put to the ultimate test. The deep connection between the characters serves as a reminder of what truly matters in a world filled with conflict. Western stories often highlight the struggle between good and evil, but in this case, it is the fight for a better future that drives the characters forward. As they prepare for the challenges ahead, they must rely on their strength and each other to overcome the darkness that threatens to engulf them. This narrative perfectly embodies the spirit of Western stories, where the land is as much a character as the people who inhabit it. Whether through intense battles or intimate moments of connection, this story weaves the rich tapestry of Western stories, offering a fresh take on timeless themes of courage, love, and resilience.